Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your guest host, Zoe Russell. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is guilty until proven innocent, the crime of civil asset forfeiture, with John Payne and Audrey Spalding of the Show Me Institute. John is a Washington University graduate with a degree in history. He's a former teacher and current research assistant at the Show Me Institute. Audrey is a policy analyst at the Show Me Institute, a graduate of the University of Missouri, and an award-winning journalist. The Show Me Institute hails from St. Louis, Missouri. It's an educational institute dedicated to well-researched, liberty-minded solutions to local policy issues. Both Audrey and John have researched and written about civil asset forfeiture and have presented at the Mises Institute's Austrian Scholars Conference. So this is kind of a different topic, not necessarily well publicized, certainly hair-raising if you happen to find yourself in the middle of it. John, can you tell us what is civil asset forfeiture?
Sure. Civil asset forfeiture is essentially it's a legal process that allows the government to take property away from accused criminals. Now, the big difference here between civil forfeiture and criminal forfeiture is that under civil forfeiture, they actually sue the property itself. So you'll see cases where it'll say U.S. government or state of Missouri versus 1972 Eldorado or versus $5,000 in cash. So that's what is known as an in rem proceeding. And since they're not actually taking a person to trial, they're taking a piece of property to trial, that property does not have all the same rights that a person does. So a lot of the due process standards that we think of for trial don't exist in these cases.
So is that what you mean by a preponderance of the evidence? You're not necessarily innocent until proven guilty. It's just a preponderance of the evidence to be able to forfeit or maintain the forfeiture over your property.
Yeah, that is one of the lower standards for civil asset forfeiture rather than for criminal law. So if you go to court and you're tried for a crime, you would have to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard in a criminal case. But in a civil asset forfeiture case, you would just have to have a preponderance of the evidence. So it's more likely than not that your property was used in a crime, and then they can take your property away from you. And so that's, we would find that unacceptable in a criminal proceeding, but we allow that under these civil proceedings where people can lose their property.
So how did the whole asset forfeiture thing come about in the very first place?
Well, a long, long time ago, it was people believed that property that was used in crimes became, by being used in that crime, evil itself, and so someone had to take it and destroy it or use it for a good purpose, and that would sort of remove the curse from that property. But in America, the main use of it started to come about as a product of the drug war in the 1970s. The big change, however, what really made civil asset forfeiture take off was in 1984 when the government passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, and that allowed law enforcement agencies to keep up to 80% of forfeiture proceeds, and that's what is known as equitable sharing. So if a policing agency, a local policing agency went out and seized someone's car and I've seen cases like this, for a DWI, because the car was used in a crime, then that car could then be sold, and the federal government could get get 20% of the money, and the state government and the state law enforcement agency would keep 80% of the funds. So it's a direct incentive for them to go out and forfeit property.
I see. So have we always in this country had criminal asset forfeiture?
Yes. If you're involved with a crime and they convict you of a crime, then you can have any property you had forfeit, possibly for recompensation or for if it was involved with a crime, to be sold off by the police. A lot of that's existed forever in this country.
Okay, let me cut you off there. We're about to go for our first break, but we'll be back with a much longer segment. Hello and welcome back to Radio Free Market. I'm Zoe Russell here with Show Me Institute researchers Audrey Spalding and John Payne. I'm filling in for Michael McKay, Radio Free Market founder. We were just discussing the difference between civil and criminal asset forfeiture. So I want to know what exactly today is the justification for seizing people's property. It's not really used as evidence in the crime, correct?
It's possible that it could be, but those forfeitures can be justified as part of criminal forfeiture. These civil forfeiture is typically that they're trying to raise money for law enforcement. That is typically the justification for it. And one of the ideas is that it would take the money out of, they wouldn't let crime pay, so that if you took money away from criminals, that it would, be another disincentive for committing crimes. But the problem, that's all well and good, but the problem is that a lot of times innocent people who get convicted of no crime have their property taken away from them under these laws.
Right. I don't necessarily think that it makes a whole lot of sense to take the property away even if they're guilty, but I guess the point being that they can't go back when they get out of jail and come back to their assets. But y'all are specifically researching the civil cases, so let's talk more about the drug. I think it was about the drug war specifically that prompted these types of laws to come about.
Well, I think one of the reasons was that there was a feeling that people weren't able to necessarily convict someone of a crime, but maybe they could take his property and then sell it and reap benefits from it. And so I think that was part of the idea originally, that part of what made it attractive to lawmakers. But, that has some negative consequences for everybody because it makes all of our property rights less secure.
Mm-hmm. So now we're in 1984 and the Comprehensive Crime Act has come about and asset forfeiture is really taking off. So what are the parameters around what local police and federal agents are allowed to confiscate? Like, let's say that a piece of property has become a crime scene, some, even innocent person's home. Can the police just do a quick scan of the household and generally remove everything inside as well as the house itself?
Yes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the scene of a crime scene per se. When we were reviewing some of the forfeitures here in Missouri, things like Xboxes could be seized under civil asset forfeiture. So, it does depend somewhat on the state, but in general, if the police can somehow suspect that you got your property through drug use or drug sales, then they can take it.
Or any sort of criminal activity. If there's a reasonable suspicion that is how you obtained the property or the property was involved in a crime in some way, then they can take that property under asset forfeiture, and you as an individual will have to sue to get it back. You will. It won't be. The trial will not happen unless you instigate it.
So there's no necessarily specific crime that's laid out. It can be for any type of crime where they think that's how you purchased said good.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay. So what does the government have to prove in order to take it? Do they have to necessarily prove anything, or can they just sort of come in and confiscate the property?
To seize it initially, all they need is a reasonable suspicion. And so that's pretty broad power there. Now, if you then fight it and go to court over it, they're going to have to prove it with a preponderance of the evidence, which is, more likely than not. And that's something that's not terrible. I think it should be the higher reasonable doubt standard, but nonetheless, a big problem is that just by seizing it initially, a person is going to have to go through all this trouble, hire a lawyer, pay for these legal fees to get it back, and because they have such wide power to seize it in the first place. And this creates a lot of problems for people who may have no criminal activity whatsoever. And so, this is something that we should probably look into stopping.
Right. And you really have to look at how a law enforcement officer or agency can get around some of the safeguards that we would think would help protect you. So, for example, as John pointed out, they can seize the property. Well, here in Missouri, we've seen some law enforcement entities assume that they have to charge you with a crime within a few days after seizing your property. But other areas of the state will wait, half a year to a year or more before charging you with a crime. So if you think about it, your property is really in limbo. It's been seized, but you haven't been charged with a crime. I think, and again, it's really important to think about what other ways a law enforcement officer, what kind of latitude he or she might have to kind of effectively circumvent the law.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to walk through it. Let's just say a crime is committed, your property's seized, you wait around until a criminal charge is filed, which could be however long, the enforcement agency takes. Then you go to court, you're found guilty, and you never get your stuff back. So is that correct in the criminal case?
That's one way that it could happen. Although even if you're found guilty of the crime, you could still potentially win the civil case and get your property back. It's possible. We've seen cases where that's happened. But there's also cases where a person is convicted of no crime, but the civil case sticks and they lose their property. And so that seems odd that our justice system would find a person not guilty in a criminal context, but then be able to take their property anyway. So that's a problem. So these are actually two separate trials, and sometimes there's not even a criminal charge ever brought against the person. There's only a civil charge against the property.
What's really important to remember is that, some states might have a stricter law to kind of help protect property owners, but the federal government still has its own asset forfeiture laws. So what we can see in Missouri, for example, which requires that you have to be convicted of a felony in order for your property to be seized, is if that criminal case never materializes, you just see that the forfeiture case, where they try to take your property, that goes federal because there's not the same burden on the federal government.
Mm-hmm. So do y'all have any idea what they do with the property while it's sort of sitting around in their coffers?
That actually is a good question. We're not entirely sure, and it varies. It's going to vary from department to department, from police agency to police agency. One of the interesting stories that we found was that in St. Louis City, they had been using civil asset forfeiture laws to seize a lot of vehicles. And these vehicles, hundreds upon hundreds of vehicles every year, more than the rest of the state combined, actually, in terms of the number of vehicles. And what the city was doing with these is that it was taking them to a it was having a private towing company tow these vehicles, and then it would call people and tell them that they had to come get their car out of impound and charge them exorbitant amounts of money to get the car out of impound, and then the towing company, if they did not show up within a month to pay off all the impound fees, the vehicle then became property of the towing company, who in some cases sold cars to, for instance, the chief of police's daughter for very, very low prices. So it was a big scandal, and when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch started reporting on this, incidentally, the number of forfeitures of vehicles in the city went down to zero within a few months. So it was a radical turnaround, but that's one instance where we actually know what they were doing with the property, and it was pretty corrupt, it seems like. But in other cases, we just don't know.
Right, exactly. So until somebody breaks the next story, then we're kind of left guessing as to what they're doing.
And that's really the pattern we see everywhere, in terms of whenever it comes to reforms to asset forfeiture laws, it seems to be that it takes some big news agency or some research organization to uncover a whole lot of material about how the laws are being circumvented in some way. And then there's change, which is really kind of upsetting, because you would think that some of the government agencies that should be monitoring this, such as state auditors, would have caught this kind of stuff, but they don't.
Mm-hmm. Right. Have you all gotten a lot of really great feedback for your work?
Well, so far we haven't actually published the full story yet, but we've talked about it with several different groups and different people, and the feedback has been pretty positive so far. So yeah, we're pretty much done with the draft, and we're sending it off for reviewers to look at here shortly. So we're hoping that they have the same opinions of the work as everyone else has so far.
So do y'all think that? I think this is pretty intuitive that police sort of pick on the average Joe small guy that's not going to really fight back because they make it so difficult to get the property back.
Yeah. I think the towing truck scandal in St. Louis is a perfect example. It's incredible that 1,000 cars were forfeited or seized in a single year, and there was no news about it, and then they were seized again the next year, and there was no news about it. And it took a number of years, and a totally different issue, which was that the police chief's daughter crashed one of the cars that had been seized through this process, for the newspaper to even start looking into it. The people whose cars were being seized just kind of, went along with, well, I guess I do have to pay a few $1,000s to get my car back, and they didn't really complain. And I think that's part of the reason that the police department and the towing company thought that, well, this was such a good money-making idea. I think it really strikes home to think that if you're carrying $300, say, in your pocket because you're going on vacation or something, that it's, if you were stopped and that money were seen on your person, there is a chance that it could be taken from you with no evidence of a crime.
Yeah, and there's one of the worst abuses of civil asset forfeiture happened in a place called Tenaha, Texas, which is this little town in East Texas, and the police there were essentially stopping motorists who were traveling through the town. Almost none of these people were residents of Tenaha, but overwhelmingly Black and Latino, and they would...
Hold on one moment there. Let me cut you off, and we'll come right back to that story after this quick break. Hi, and welcome back to Radio Free Market. I'm here with Audrey, Spalding, and John Payne of the Show Me Institute. We're talking about civil asset forfeiture and basically guilty until proven innocent. So we were just talking about a small East Texas town that's pretty notorious for this type of stuff. John, can you keep telling your story about Tenaha?
Yeah, sure. So in Tenaha, they were mostly pulling over motorists who were traveling through the town. Most of these people were Black or Hispanic, and the police were essentially shaking them down for their money or their property. One gentleman, Roderick Daniels, he was pulled over for driving 37 miles per hour in a 35 zone, and then the police discovered that he was traveling with about $8,500 in cash on him. Daniels claimed that this was to purchase a car, and the police had no evidence that he was traveling with drugs or that he had committed any sort of crime, but they took the money as being evidence automatically of him being involved in some sort of criminal activity. And so they took him into custody and threatened him with a money laundering charge, a criminal charge, if he didn't sign a waiver giving the money, saying, I have no claim to this money, therefore the Tenaha Police Department can have it. Now, this is back to Daniels after it was uncovered that he was just one among many who this had happened to, and criminal charges were never filed. They never had any evidence that these people were guilty of any crimes, but they would take the money. And now, one thing that's most disturbing about this is this doesn't even necessarily qualify as civil forfeiture. This is what we would call forfeiture through abandonment. And because when Daniels renounced his claim to the money, the police don't have to fill out any paperwork calling it civil asset forfeiture. The extent of this problem is largely unknown. At least in Missouri, the policing agencies don't have to report on it. We have some anecdotal evidence that it may be going on up here, but we don't have any firm way of establishing how often. And so this is the extent of this problem is very hard to establish, and it's pretty troublesome.
Yeah, it sounds pretty troublesome. So I read also, and this town was actually pretty well reported because I knew of it before I'd heard about the two of your research, that they were threatening them with I'm going to take your children away and hand them over to Child Protection Services, and just immense amounts of people. I had a statistic here, seized property from 140 motorists over 3 years and filed criminal charges against fewer than half. And then they brought a civil action lawsuit, all of them together, and that's the only reason that they sort of got any media play.
Well, I have to say, Tenaha, Texas is a really bad example, but the statistic you just cited about taking property and only filing criminal charges in about half is what we're seeing here in Missouri. And that's the stuff that's reported. That's not this administrative, that's not this abandonment forfeiture.
Right.
Right. That's just, they seized property from you. They said it was civil forfeiture, and yet still, even though Missouri requires them to file a criminal charge, still fewer than half have no criminal charges at all. And so that really raises the question, again, oh, well, sure, we're going to file a criminal charge in the future. Well, it's like, well, how long do we have to wait for that? I think certainly one solution would be to say, well, if you don't file a criminal charge in 6 months or, 3 months, then you need to provide an answer as to why. You better explain yourself, because from at this point, it certainly doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. So how did y'all come upon this research topic in the first place? Of course, I occasionally go to public meetings, and I went to the St. Charles County Council budget planning meeting, which...
St. Charles, for any listeners who are not familiar with St. Louis geography, is a fairly well-to-do suburb of St. Louis off to the northwest. So.
Right, and they actually do a lot of asset forfeiture, unbeknownst to me. I was there for something completely unrelated, but while I was there, they were discussing what to do with the more than $1 million they had collected in asset forfeiture money. And federal asset forfeiture money is not supposed to go to funding ongoing operations, so things like salaries and supplies that you use up frequently, because there's the intent of, not having police agencies get addicted to asset forfeiture.
Right.
The idea being, you can use this money for bigger purchases, maybe a building or a car or something, but we don't want you to fund all of your salaries with it. So what St. Charles County Council was saying was, well, we have all this money, what do we do with it? And lo and behold, they wanted to spend it on salary increases for their sheriffs and for their other law enforcement officers. But they couldn't do that because of the federal restrictions. So what they did is they said, okay, we will take money out of our budget for the purchase of cars, and we will use that money to pay for the increase in salaries, and then we will take this federal money and replace the funds we just took out from funding cars. And so that immediately, and if St. Charles County can do it, anyone can do it, It's not that hard, it's not rocket science. But that immediately made me kind of talk to John and say, well, gosh, maybe we should look at this, because this was just so blatant. And one of the reasons is that, these budgetary planning meetings are extremely boring. Nobody goes to them, and so it's perfectly fine for them to just sit there and describe things that really fly in the face of federal law, but do them anyway.
Basically, Enron accounting, right in public view.
Yeah. I mean, it is incredible what people will say at even local city meetings. Well, we're about to head into a break, and we'll come back with our long segment. Our topic is civil asset forfeiture, so stay with us.